You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Well, welcome. Is this the equivalent, man? It was so for those of you following along at home, Jay and I were together again, reunited, if you will, over the course of the last weekend. Jay flew up to Toronto, and it was the first time we've seen each other. I think, right? It'd be the first time we saw each other since I started losing a bunch of weight, and it's the first time I saw you since you've gained a bunch of weight.
Right, yeah.
And it's funny to just watch the mass just shift through the computer.
Yeah. That's like the law of conservation of energy or something. It's like you and I are one entity.
Right. No Jordan can be created or destroyed.
Right, exactly.
Or just transferred. All mass cannot. We will collectively always be like, I don't know, what's our collective body weight? I'm like 240 now. You're 240. Let's call it like 420. Yeah. I don't know.
We'll call it like 440.
Okay. So say when I was 270, what were you?
I was about
does that check out?
Like 170. So what's that number?
Yeah. I mean, 7 and 7 seems like that's so funny, dog.
Yo,
man. Yeah, dude. Well, I honestly think sometimes, that we weren't supposed to meet each other.
This is
this is like the Black Mirror thing where they saw each other or something. They're like, we were just copy and pasted kind of. And we were just meant to walk these ships passing through the night lives, and we just ended up at the same school, and now we do, well, pretty much everything.
Yeah, we do all the same shit.
So for those of you who are unaware, Jay and I not only have the same vocation, we co-found the same company and podcast. We have the same undergrad. We also have the same middle name, which was fucking wild. And our birthdays are 9 days apart.
9, yeah.
Yeah. So as close to just like God going, I don't know, copy paste, like just fucking go. I'm sick of making people. We'll just make this one duplicate. So we just came off the weekend together planning next year and what we have in store with Prescript. Very excited. If you're listening to this, welcome to Wednesday, October 23rd. If you're a part of the Prescript community and you're in the level 2 or have taken the level 2, PSL 3 for January is now currently up for sale. Now, it's likely sold out. However, shoot one of us a message because if you haven't got an invite for whatever reason, we will send one to you if they're still available. We sold out every L3 we've ever done. But hey, shoot your shot. We do put on a wait list. Just starts drinking Diet Sprite right before the podcast, burps the first 7 minutes. People do have change in plans and schedules and things like that. So if you want, just reach out to me at @the_muscle_doc, shoot me a DM or shoot us an email, info@pre-script.com or Jiunta at red, white, WITE, and Jordan on IG. And we'll see if we can't get you squared away. Those of you who aren't part of the Prescript community, the level 1 for 2025, which will be the first class of the year, will start late January, but you can get in the opt-in list now. This is the only discount we offer for people getting into the level 1. So if you go to www.pre-script.com/PSL1, drop your email in there. You'll get notified when the registration goes live, and you'll get the only discount that we offer for the course just for leaving your email address there.
And an important note, if you're not in the Prescript community yet and you've seen the level 3 and you see how sick it looks to work with NFL players, NFL prospects, right now, if you get into the January class of the level 1, that will put you on trajectory within the next year by January 2026 to be in the level 3. So keep that in mind.
Yeah. Level 2 probably run mid-year, and then we then leave you eligible for L3 January 26. Knee pain on the docket today.
Yeah.
This one's near and dear to my heart. Dude, we were training this weekend and I had to explain, it was the first time I said it out loud of how I've sustained my knee injuries of late. So I had a competitive powerlifting career that spanned many years and took many dents out of the fender in the process. But a new one I did my right meniscus, and like when I say did, like minor tears, I can tell they're minor because they're non-surgical fixes, and I can rehab them quite quickly. Which I'm going to try and share some of the fixes of how I did that over this podcast today. But I just don't want anyone to think, well, what does this guy know? He's never had knee pain. Nah, I'll do you one better. I barely have knees, and I can still do stuff. So I was going down, and fucking St. Louis, Missouri is one of those places that just doesn't have to exist. Shout out Tony and Isaac at St. Louis Sports Clinic. But like, seriously, St. Louis is just a hole. I walked down this like ramp, and it's an old man injury, but I was walking down this like ramp outside this hotel that used to be a train station. And I like slipped and it was wet and I shredded my right meniscus. Then I like was at the airport and my knee was, blowing up like a balloon. My flight was delayed. It was the whole thing. And then I was like, all right, put the rehab hat on. It's kind of what I do. How can I fix myself? Dude, I am a mattress on the floor. Are you a mattress on the floor guy? Do you have a bed?
I have a bed and a bed frame. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's the most adult part of my life.
That's your mattress I'm standing in front of your mattress in my house on the floor.
I know. I love it.
Sleeping
in that room is great because it's so dark. I can sleep for 24 hours in that room. Straight.
It's a dungeon for sure. I thought about spending a few nights in here after you left, but then I realized, well, I'm not here for a few nights. But I'm surprised. You're like a very like minimal guy.
I am. Yeah. I have nothing in my apartment besides like a bed and a whole bunch of shoes.
Yeah, but the frame though.
Bed frame, yeah.
All right, so question, if you're going to move, does the frame come with you or are you like, fuck it?
See, it's the thing that is consistent is it's a very minimal frame. It's like just the box around with like a little headboard that slides on. So I think if the big if is if I take the mattress, which I probably will because I really like my mattress, then the bed frame will come too.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm a mattress on the floor guy, as that should surprise zero people. And I was getting out of bed the other morning and my knee made a noise and I was uncertain of the joint that made the noise. I thought someone got shot outside my building. And it was like, that was a new one. And I've been hobbling around ever since. And I'm assuming, and like, this is where I want to get into fixing knee pain as sort of the subject header of today's episode is, well, first, like any injury, you need to be good at triaging and troubleshooting what the source of the pain is.
Yeah.
Because if we're going to try and fix anything, you need to know what you're fixing first, right? That's like big. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. And I think one of the reasons they do is because as people put out pieces of content around this very like clickbaity shit, like, hey, what do people like to listen to? And clickbait usually means it carries with it some implicit value to the viewer or listener, right? Like, sometimes that implicit value is people like watching people get shot on the internet or something. And it's just like, that's clickbait, or they like controversy. But if we're trying to like optimize for learning, like, I don't think clickbait can be all bad. It's just, I think it has to be the clickbait and switch of like, okay, we got you in the door, how to fix knee pain. And I think the first place to start is troubleshooting. Is like, okay, what are the structures involved in the pain I'm feeling? We can, and I'll kind of like give my 2 cents on this, is I will break things down in my brain kind of on a scale or buckets of subclinical and clinical, which means like, I'm going to have a go at this myself with some rehab principles that I am aware of that I've used on other people. And then there's like clinical, which is like, no. I'm not doing anything until I get an MRI. This feels really bad. Now, the longer you've been in the game, the more injuries you've sustained, the more likely you are to mess up the border in between. But I think the older you get and as you move through your training career, the goal should be as you sustain these injuries and you maybe sound the clinical alarm and realize that it's something to be managed subclinically, or you are like, nah, I'm good, and then end up in a hospital bed, is to really refine that line of like, okay, what is my next 24 hours look like, right? It's almost like a hostage taking. I don't know if I watched Man on Fire on a flight the other day, one of the greatest movies of all time. Tell me you've seen it.
I have not.
No. What? Man on Fire, classic Denzel Washington, unbelievable. Anyways, like any hostage movie, Taken would be another one. Mm-hmm. Like, what you do in the first 24 hours in all those hostage movies is like the biggest thing to the indicator to success. So knee pain and fixing pain in general, but I find the knees are quite precarious because when we start to look at triage and troubleshooting joints and pain and joints in any capacity, we're always having this yin and yang of structure and function. It's like, okay, if we're going to triage and troubleshoot, what are the structures that could be potentially injured, right? Or what could be triggering us to have pain? And those are two different things. Pain and injury are different. And when we look at the knee and you think, okay, how much of this is structure? How much of it is function, meaning like muscles and tendons? And how could we potentially use what we know about the function to maybe offset potential damage in the structure, right? And you start to put a list of like, okay, what's structure and what's function? And you start to realize like, there's like a lot of shit that can go wrong in the knee and like not a ton of ways at the knee directly that could fix it. And you're like, oh, fuck, this could be kind of like bad, right? So if the early stages, your first 24 hours, you get knee pain, you're lifting, you're walking down the fucking sidewalk in St. Louis, you're getting out of your mattress on the floor, and your initial thought is like, okay, one, structure function. What could it be? Two, what does my next 24 hours look like? Those two decisions, the accuracy of those two decisions, how close to you can get to what's actually happening, will vastly accelerate their success. Because I want to leave something open, right? It could be that first 24 hours you're going in to get surgery. That could be an option. And I think a lot of people in the training and rehab space can be very anti-surgery. It's like, no. If I know, and I'm really good now at like, this is clinical, this is subclinical. If I had like a quad tendon rupture, the best thing I can do is get my ass in the fucking surgery table, like in the first 24 hours. So that's like a starting point for me. It's like, all right, structure function. And I want to unpack that a little bit as we move forward. Like, what are the structures of the knee? What do we commonly associate some structural damage with when it comes to perception of pain? And then based off of that, going, well, what does my next 24 hours look like? How could I begin to manage this conservatively versus should I go get this checked out more clinically?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And that's understanding those two things, that shows the course or the trajectory of treatment, right? Is structural things. There's only a few structures in the knee that we're really looking at in terms of, all right, is surgery on the table here? Or ACL, MCL, PCL, meniscus. You could be looking at like, I don't know, you could be looking at like patellar fractures or like condylar fractures, things like that. But they're a little bit more rare. And usually what you're trying to look at is what's the mechanism here, right? Like getting out of bed and a grenade goes off in your knee, you're probably not looking at any type of fracture there, right? It's going to be a pretty high impact injury, where maybe the first thing that's indicated is imaging, right? If it's to the degree that, well, maybe not even if it's to the degree, but if the mechanism is more of an acute injury, if there was an incident of injury, and if it was something impact, like you're playing a sport, you're playing football, you have a lateral impact, something of the sort, or it's something more traumatic in nature, then imaging might be the first thing, right? If it's something that's a little bit more transient or something that's a little bit more chronic, then a lot of times I'm not necessarily going to jump to say imaging, but we can start to look for symptoms of, okay, is this something that looks to be more muscular or functional in nature? Or is this something that looks to be a little bit more structural in nature? And meniscus is like one of those kind of in-between ones where it can kind of look like both, but there are some kind of telltale signs if you have a meniscus injury. Like the ones that I look out for and I'll talk to people about is like locking or giving out of the knee. That's a big one. Or like joint line pain in deep knee flexion. That's another one that will point in my mind towards meniscus injury. Outside of that, it's like stability, functionality. Like there's things like, I remember, dude, it's probably been, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. We were sitting on the turf at Pure Muscle and Fitness. You're like, yo, will you check out my knee? And I just like do an anterior draw test on your left knee, and it just keeps going. Like there's no ligament here to stop anterior translation of this tibia. So I was like, all right, that's probably more of a structural injury. But once you start to be able to kind of batch things into these buckets, and I don't, everyone listening, I don't expect you guys to do this, especially if you're trainers, like that may not be your job, but someone comes in with a diagnosis or someone comes in after an injury, you can start to look towards, all right, what are the things that they're able to do? What are things they're unable to do? And the better understanding you have of that injury, is it more structural? Is it more functional? Then that gives you a better idea towards what kind of outcome you're going to get and what type of treatment plan you're going to have with that person. Like if it is structural, like you clearly have no ACL in your left knee, like, all right, well, what's the function of the ACL? The ACL is there to prevent anterior translation of the tibia in knee flexion. Cool, sick. What else functions in that same way? The hamstrings, right? They're going to prevent anterior translation of that tibia as the knee flexes. So it's like there are answers that we can look towards to use the function to bolster structural deficits or vice versa, right? It's not often we want to use the structure to bolster functional deficits, but if we do have a functional deficit, then understanding, okay, what type of injury does this look like? Is this like a muscle strain, a muscle tear? Is this inflammatory? Is it something that's more chronic? Is it something that's more acute? And then you can start to pool things from that information to get you to understand what is the way out of this? So I think it might be cool to run these in parallel because you have a very structural issue with your knee. And we could talk about like how you go about training and rehabbing that. I had something that was more on the function side. Like I've had knee pain on and off my entire weightlifting career, but beginning of 23, so about a year and a half ago now, I had one specific clean where I had an injury. I didn't get it checked out, but from my assessment, I believe it was a partial tear of my right quad tendon, which is, yes, kind of in between that function and structure, but it's more on the functional side, right? The tendon is just a non-contractile part of a muscle. So the way that I went about assessing that and rehabbing that is probably a bit different than the way you went about assessing and rehabbing your knee. So I guess I'll toss it back to you with like knowing that there's a lot of structural deficit in that knee, and you've been, I don't know, what did you say your best squat was? Like 780 something?
Nah, it's the competition's 750.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah,
My bad. 750. Okay. So like going from that, and like I've known you since before you squatted that.
Yeah.
And I haven't known you to take any time off of training between then and now. So like what has that looked like for you to continue to train through that and to be able to continue to have progress in the areas that you need to stay as functional as you need to be?
Yeah. So I think, if we're following along at home, and I realize that we're a podcast that people take notes on, which is like kind of cool. Insane. And you know what? Fucking right. It's like, I'm glad we're that. Like, so if you're listening, so first thing we talked about was like, all right, triage and troubleshoot. Let's do some damage control. First 24 hours, the decision we make between bucketing, subclinical versus clinical, right? And then we go a level deeper than that. And then in our notes, we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the structure? What's the function? You listed off ACL, MCL, PCL, ALL, medial lateral meniscus, patella tendon, and quad tendon, et cetera. But then you look at like hamstring and you look at gastroc and you look at quad and you're like, all right, we got something to play with. Iliotibial band could also be thrown into the mix there a little bit. So, okay, we understand structure function. Okay, so we're kind of like a few layers deep in Inception already. My thing now is to introduce passive versus active range of motion, right? Passive versus active range of motion to me is going to be a pretty good determinant of where I'm at. So if I'm getting pain, if I'm getting apprehension, if I'm getting discomfort actively, which is like usually the case, very rarely do I have pain passively, but not actively, meaning this. So with my knee specifically, if I'm like, if I'm flexing my knee, so this is going to bifurcate yet again. So if you're taking notes, we're going passive versus active. And then if we're going active, we're splitting that into two groups and going loaded versus unloaded, right? Because if I can sit there and unload my knee flex, which is like usually better than load knee flex. So meaning like I just stand there, I put my hand on a wall, I take my left foot off the ground and I try and like flex my hamstring as much as I can. And then, flexing my knee, extend my knee, flex my quad. So that's a data point, right? So for me, if I can get passive range of motion through a half decent range, I know I'm in the money, right? Like if I can get passive range of motion, and we haven't reached a critical mass of structural damage yet. That's where I kind of have that like, yes, we're still out there taking shots, right? So that's a big one. And I'll give you an example of when that never happened. So I think I probably told this story on the podcast a few times before, but I was competing in a meet in Australia, and a gentleman who was probably the biggest squatter in my flight, I think he went down with 771. I think his name was Nathan Jones. And I was warming up for bench. I already taken my piddly 705 squat or whatever it was at the time. And he was taking 77.1, but he went down on the platform. Now, no one really knew what happened. They called me, and I was still like early in both of my chiropractic career and my lifting career. This is like my third meet. And I like come out with the back with my singlet on, and like there's this guy, like, and they've got him onto a chair. And I'm literally running this very equation that we're talking about right now. I'm like, I didn't see it. I heard the weight crash to the ground. I heard my name. I ran out. First time I met John Sheridan. Shout out John Sheridan, a great friend of mine. And me and Cheryl kind of looked at each other. We're like, what the fuck? And, you know, someone goes down with weight on their back. You kind of have a default to they probably tore their quad in powerlifting. Or shout out Stu Locke, I guess. And right. Yeah. Plural. And then, so I was like, I literally, you know, I'm hopped up on caffeine. I'm on the other side of the world. I don't really know what the fuck to do. So the only thing I could think of was like, okay, passive versus active. I took his knee as his foot laid on the floor, and he sat on a chair, and I lifted his foot off the floor. And I said, right, is this painful? He's like, no, not really. And I was like, okay, I want you to keep your foot here. I'm going to let go. Do you understand? And he's like, yes. And then I let the foot go, and it just sunk like a stone. And I was like, okay, I think we're good here. We have no unloaded passive range of motion. We have problems, right? So for me, I literally the other day, I hop out of bed, fucking knee goes, you know, frag grenade, great analogy. And then I'm like, I'm standing, but I'm standing entirely on my right leg. I was like, okay, what do I do? So I try and go passive range of motion. I like lean into it a little bit. It feels like it's already starting to swell. I'm like, okay, it's not great. I stand there. I flex my hamstring. It's non-painful, but I feel pressure. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be okay. It's subclinical, right? So right there, I've gained a lot of data, and dude, I'm 5 seconds into this process, right? I'm 5 seconds into a very important 24-hour window, but I've already gone through like weight bearing versus non-passive versus active range of motion. Where are we at here? And I've checked enough boxes for me to feel confident that we're still in a subclinical case, and we're just going to move forward. Now, here's where I evolve out from this. You need to be, and this is a skill, and I think the stronger the athlete you are, and or maybe not even stronger, but like the more athletic you are, the more this skill and sensitivity is honed in. I am pushing this fucking thing to its limit non-stop for the first 24 hours, right? I will, like when I did my right knee, I walked more in the St. Louis airport than I would normally walk in an airport. Usually I grab a coffee, I sit down, I crack the laptop, and I was like, no, I have a window. I have a window now within this first 24 hours to decide what my next 2 weeks is going to look like. And I don't want to let that window close. So I decided, look, it's subclinical. We're going to manage this. And I started hobbling my ass around the airport for 7 hours nonstop. Right? As much as my cardiovascular system could support me walking for 7 hours. And that's where we start to understand, like, okay, if we've made a decision and we feel confident about our subclinical diagnosis, we then need to realize that what's going to really hold us back past these next 24 hours is the learned experience of pain and a plasticity and range of motion. That plasticity is coming from here. So I need to keep this fucker stimulated as best I can, right? So with minimal resources at my disposal in the St. Louis airport, walking is so, like, I hear walking a lot espoused in spinal rehabilitation, which I think is super valuable. Mm-hmm. Walking in knee rehab is like so unbelievably understated. Like it is, I walk more now with two knees that are a little bit iffy. My right one's feeling much better and has been, up until like a week after the injury, I was feeling pretty good. Left knee feels phenomenal compared to where it was a few days ago where I exploded my knee. but I walk a lot, right? And the walking, walking highlights a lot of the properties of the knee that when we do go into concerted bouts of rehabilitation, that a lot of the principles that I'll draw, like if I were to go into the gym and be like, hey, I'm not going to train today, I'm just going to do some rehab stuff on my knee. One, I'm going to train today because that is rehab stuff for the knee. But I see a lot of people do that. The things that I'm going to do preemptively, like any sort of activation, or if I'm working with a client and we don't have the luxury to go through and weight train for whatever reason, all of the things that I'm going to do, I can pull directly out of principles and mechanics of gait cycle, right? Whether it's, at the ankle or the foot, whether it's at the tibia, whether it's at the hip and the pelvis. These are all things that come very inherently to us when we walk. Here's the caveat. We want to avoid practicing bad practice, right? I will, to what degree is possible, try and emulate. I say I was hobbling around the airport. I'm trying to actually not. I will walk a pace where I'm not learning how to walk different around that injury. So you can pay attention. Like when you have an issue with your knee, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll strike the ground with your knee extended fully, right? You won't strike the ground with a soft knee. So rather than having to learn all of the mechanics of gait cycle, what you can do is, if you have knee pain, have your good knee teach your other knee how to walk, and walk as slow as you have to so that you feel comfortable replicating that. And that for me is like first 24 hours, we run those few tests immediately, and you have to get moving. You have to start moving it right away. And then from there, I'm starting to plan my first lower body training session as an adjusted version of what I've already done leading into this knee injury. Like my leg day is that day or tomorrow. I'm going in and doing whatever abbreviated version of that as I can, even if it's just with the opposite leg that's not in pain.
Fuck yeah. I think that's a really good and useful way to look at injuries. And I'll kind of weigh against that with a more kind of functional injury that I had, and those like 5 seconds post injury, what my assessment looked like and how that informed my rehab from there. So like I said earlier, it's the injury that I had. I believe it to be a quad tendon partial tear. The reason I believe that, so the mechanism of injury here was I was in a meet. It was my second clean and jerk. I had caught the clean, and in the bottom of that clean, I felt a pop in my right knee, and it felt like I got stabbed in the knee. Somehow I was able to, stand it up. And then I just remember the moment in between the clean and the jerk where I'm just standing there. It's like, well, I'm not going to take another lift after this, because I immediately thought it was my ACL. I'm like, that has to be my fucking ACL. Like nothing else is going to pop like that. Like that was an insane feeling. I had my knee wrapped, so there's a little bit of like structural support there. But I'm like, fuck it. I'm here. I'm going to try and make this jerk, and we'll see what happens. Now, it was my right leg, and my right leg is the foot that goes forward in a jerk. And this is actually, like, looking back at, this was part of the assessment process for me, is like, I'm going to fucking try it and we'll see what happens. Now, I went for the jerk. I made the jerk, and it didn't increase pain at all in that knee. I'm like, all right, that's really interesting. So kind of what I'm looking for, and this is retroactively, I'm not thinking this in the moment, but like, all right, so right leg in the jerk, if you jerk properly, you should be in less than 90 degrees of flexion in the front leg as you go through a jerk. So, as you get into that position, really the more active muscle group here, it's going to be the hamstrings preventing anterior tibial translation. Right. So I'm pulling back into myself here, as opposed to if you it's called a short step in the jerk, and you get into greater than 90 degrees in knee flexion, then it's going to be all quads. It's you kind of concentrically loading the quads to prevent further knee flexion. So that was one thing. It's like, okay, like it may or may not be ACL at that point, but I don't know if it's quad or not. So I make the jerk, cool, drop it, get off the platform. Immediately it swells up. I'm like, fuck, this has to be ACL. I don't understand how this could not be. I hobble over, I sit down, take off my knee wrap. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to fucking be able to do anything. And then shortly after, like I passed out my last lift and I'm like, all right, what the fuck do I do with this thing? Is I go through a similar process. I'm like, all right, let's see how this feels as I move it. And as I squeeze my quad and brought it into knee extension, that was incredibly painful. Like like even just the activation of the quad. I'm like, oh, like a searing pain in the front of my knee. I'm like, all right, so let's go the other way. And I pull it into knee flexion, and it feels okay at first, but as I get more and more into that knee flexion, then it starts to hurt as well. I'm like, all right, so when I activate the quads, this hurts. When I stretch the quads, this hurts. All right. So maybe not structural, maybe more functional. And it seemed to, over the next few days, kind of localize to the front of the knee and not necessarily that joint capsule of the knee. So I'm like, all right, this is evidence that it's probably not ligamentous. Like I don't feel knee instability itself. It's more so with either actively shortening or passively lengthening the quads. I'm like, all right, this is probably a quad injury. So that was kind of my first level of assessment there. And then after that, I went the same route as you. It's like, all right, well, how is this going to affect me if there is tissue damage here? I'm not necessarily going to be able to load the quad, load the knee. That's not going to be the most useful vector of rehab right now. Maybe down the line, when I have a bit better structural integrity of that tendon, that will be useful. But right now, the best thing that I can do to not fuck myself up more is make sure that I'm moving in a biomechanically consistent way upstream and downstream from that knee. So what that looked like for me was like very similar. It's like making sure it didn't change gait cycle mechanics. Absolutely. And then also making sure that it didn't change hip and ankle mechanics along with that. So there was a time where I'm like, all right, I can't really train through knee flexion, but what I can do is I can stabilize that knee enough to go through hinging movements. I can do more externally supported movements. And what that looked like for me was doing like unilateral hinging, like B stance RDL, single leg RDL type stuff to maintain the mechanics at the hip that are going to be more advantageous for taking stress off of that knee in that kind of medium term of where I'm waiting for the tissue damage to heal, but I'm still trying to do something that's going to be productive in the overall rehab plan or the scheme of rehab for that knee. And then the two things that I put in that were new at this point in my training were both seated and like knee flex and knee extended calf extensions, because I definitely have a fucked up ankle on that side too. That's a little bit independent of this, but what I wanted to do is make sure that I had proper movement through the ankle, through the foot, and then through the hip as well, so that whatever I was doing, I wasn't putting any extra stress on that knee, so that I didn't have to worry about any other sort of complications along the healing process other than tissue healing time.
Yeah, I think as you start to zoom out and as you start to as the oh fuck start to go away, like the oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck, and the dust settles, starting to take a look at exercises that you don't realize are knee, I don't want to say dominant, because you would realize them if they're dominant, but understanding where in your exercise that you start to use your knees and you might not realize it, right? So like one for me is, and it's an exercise that I perform quite often, but it's something that finds its way as a staple in my program, is like a chest fly, like a cable machine fly thing. Because the way I support myself on that exercise, and I'm going to lift off like an index of exercises that I think are a little bit atypical for knee rehab, but I think really good opening tools to use when trying to get some stimulus back in the knee. I use like a very kind of obtuse angle at the knee when I'm supporting on a chest fly. I don't sit with my toes tucked back at an acute knee angle and do the flies like this. I kind of just like put my feet in front of me and I kind of have this isometric 160 degrees knee flexion. And I just like fall into the thing. So I'm trying to just like passively shift all my body weight into the pad. But in doing so, I'm at like almost a terminal, not fully extended 180 degree, like straight knee, but I'm at like 160 degrees of like pretty isometric, high intensity knee fly. And I'm just holding this iso for like 45 and I'm doing a chest fly. Right. I'm not doing wall sits. I'm not doing anything. I'm just doing the equivalent of like an 18th squat wall sit, 18th depth wall sit while I do a pec fly. And then there's also like hip thrusts or something that I don't tend to do often. And glute hypertrophy is not a target of mine. I don't think it's the greatest exercise in the world. But there is a weird isometric moment at the knee around 90 degrees. So something like that, I think, is a useful drill when you're rehabbing a knee from a movement perspective. I already talked about walking as probably maybe your first entry into, okay, if I can walk, I can lift, right? But I think as we start to now go, okay, I'm getting back into the gym, whether it's the next day, whether it's the next week, I have a subclinical knee injury, I've got enough data points and confidence that I can start testing this thing. But don't necessarily go test it right away with things that are going to be, acutely addressing the knee, unless, of course, you feel as if you can and the knee injury wasn't nearly as bad as you thought. If you do feel the need to stay on course, I think there is great research to support this cross-pollination from an innervation perspective of training the opposite leg and reaping benefits of maintaining muscle mass in the injured leg. I think exercise of any higher intensity is going to allow you to undergo a process called exercise-induced analgesia, which means you feel less pain when you train. Right. So in breaking that cycle, and this is kind of where my thought was at after my St. Louis debacle and my getting out of bed debacle, in breaking that cycle, I was like, okay, I have legs on today. Did my passive active. I did my loaded, unloaded. I was like, okay, this is subclinical. I'm going to go in. I'm going to walk to the gym. Number one, I'm going to see how I feel. Pushing it kind of like I'm trying to make sure I'm walking symmetrical as best I can. And there are some moments where it's asymmetrical, getting up and down curbs and shit like that. But I got to the gym and I was like, okay, I feel like I can go ahead and do, a super light quad extension bilaterally and see if I can lower it on the eccentric with that bad leg. Did it first day, got to be honest, didn't work. Too much pain, too much pressure. I was like, okay, cool. Good to know. Then I did both up, no pain, and then lowered the eccentric with the good leg. I was like, okay, this is where we're at. And I did that for some ascending sets until I hit a threshold where the load on the bilateral extension was too much for that knee to handle. And then I said, okay. And then I just did working sets there. And I did that for every exercise, right? So hamstrings had a little bit further range in the hamstrings, a little bit more loadability before I was doing single leg hamstrings. Then I went to a leg press. Same thing. I started with both. We could understand in this closed chain environment now that it wasn't really as good as long as the quad extension and the hamstring curl. Did two. First empty sled was like, you know what? Let me try like a kickstand, right? Let me try a kickstand where that leg is less loaded. Even the passive flexion now of that knee being into more flexion. I was like, you know what? We're doing single leg press. And then we're going to walk home. I did single leg press with my right leg, walked home. Next day, crawled out of bed, felt better. Just this on last two nights. The first night I remember going to bed, I was worried about my knee locking in my sleep. It woke me. I'm rolling over from one side of the bed to the other. I was like, I need to like flex my quad so that my tibia did not rotate on my femur. Yeah. That was night one. I was like, fuck, that sucked. Night two, last night, after walking to the gym, walking back, training legs, didn't have that issue. And this brings me to like another point. And these are, you know what these are? These are rehab principles that we're just applying to the knee, especially if you're a coach and you're not just dealing with injuries of yourself, but you're dealing with the injuries of other people. There's a mnemonic that you learn. It's a way to memorize all of the things that are important about asking about an injury. And the end of the mnemonic is ADL. We teach this in level 1, activities of daily living. It's about understanding how people's injuries affect their activities of daily living, because those are going to be the most accurate data points that they have. You and I can sit here and go subclinical, clinical, passive, active, structure, function. And we can do all this like nerd book learning stuff where most people are going to be like, I don't know, man, it hurts walking up the stairs, but it doesn't hurt walking down the stairs. And you have to go, okay, we need to do two things here. We need to start to understand, just what these mechanisms of we need to understand what these mechanisms of load really mean when people tell us these activities of daily living that they find troublesome in their everyday life. And we also need to understand that these are prompts that people are probably not going to pay attention to and not going to notice as they make progress, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, yes, I'm very mindful of the way my knee was kind of waking me up in the middle of the night when I wanted to turn over because I didn't want my knee to lock because I shredded my meniscus. And I'm also very mindful of when that doesn't happen. Most people who aren't in this training space, who aren't, they don't make their living off of this, they are not going to notice when these warning signs go away, which is the sign that we're making progress. So if you are harboring or fostering this relationship with an injured client or patient or athlete, you need to be sure to call on this very useful mile marker of progress and be like, hey, upstairs, downstairs, your knee still hurting? Oh, shit. No, it's not. Hey, we're doing the thing. We're doing the thing. All right. Okay. Let's back in. We'll keep progressing. We're making progress. And that positive reinforcement is so useful in continuing to make those strides back to whatever the new 100% looks like. So for me, that's something that because I know it's the first thing that's going to happen because I'm always testing my knee. Right. I'm always, and it can be difficult for people who don't have a mental preoccupation to try to solve these problems to understand how the testing of the knee that they're doing is manifesting in, healing the knee. But for me, it's like, I know I have an opportunity to test how much better my knee is getting 24/7. Right? Yeah. Not just in the concerted window of when I'm in the gym. However, if you're a client or a coach or a clinician working, or if you're a trainer, a coach or clinician working with an athlete or a patient or whatever, and you're someone who's only paying attention to their knee when they're in the gym, it's your job as a coach or a clinician to be like, hey, while you're here, let's talk about all the time outside of here to see where we've made progress. And I think a lot of clients a lot of coaches, miss the ball on, or they miss the mark on that data point. They don't collect it, they don't track it. And that's fucking gold, because that's the thing that's working for you while you're not training. They're coming in and they're looking at the quad extension, or they're looking at the leg press, or they're looking at the hamstring curl, being like, woe is me. But you can open up that aperture to include their everyday life and be like, hey, those things in your day-to-day life that you told me are bothersome because of this injury, are any of them still bothersome? And they can start checking, oh, well, shit. Oh, okay. Wow. I realize this rehab process is happening not just when I'm here at the gym, but it's happening when I'm walking up the stairs, when I'm walking my kid to work, when I'm going to bed, when I wake up. That is such a game changer. And I don't even like the term, for clinicians, for coaches, to learn the value of that data point, because it really allows you to respect the rehab process outside of what little we can control in our time we have with our clients and athletes.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because those are the subjective variables that are going to show progress maybe before they start to have objective progress, right? So that's kind of the gradient right there, is like, oh, like, can you get out of bed without pain, up, down the stairs? Can you get in and out of your car without pain? Like, you're going to see progress there before you see progress on the quad extension, on the hamstring curl, on the hinge movements. So I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, is that, yeah, there's going to be this gradient of progress where in the gym, if you're just looking at objectives, it might be a 0 to 1 kind of progression, but there's all these 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 in between that you'll see progress before you see that bump from 0 to 1 in the gym. And
I think one thing is, when we think about assessments on the whole, whether it's in the rehab process or not, I think you always have to understand, and I think this is where conventional models of movement assessment have failed, albeit still, I think revolutionary in their time. When we look at assessments of a movement, of people, you have to have a subjective component. These scoring systems of 0, 1, 2, 3 in pain, that is not the human experience. right?
Yeah.
So whenever we're doing an assessment, whether it's in rehab, whether it's in baseline assessment, whatever that tends to look like, and I could go on about that, assessment has to have a subjective, and not just a subjective interpretation of pain, a subjective interpretation of where they're feeling what, right? That is so key. Every movement assessment that doesn't have a subjective component is not a movement assessment for human beings.
Yeah, I like that point. And one more thing I'm going to add, kind of talking through the rehab process. And this is, it's kind of meant to be a bit buzzwordy, but the idea is that if you hear this, you gotta understand the context too. This is like for anterior knee pain of a functional origin. I think the best starting place, like, and I'm going to put some like very actionable things on this because I think this is something that can help a lot of people. This is baseline principle. The best place to start is with external support, looking towards creating better function through isolated ranges of motion and isolating the biomechanics of the region so that you can then put it into what full gait cycle mechanics look like. And what that looked like for me when I started with my knee was the rehab was, it was literally just seated on an adduction abduction machine. And then it was a 45-degree hip extension. It's like I'm coordinating basically through all three planes here because there's a vector of rotation through adduction, abduction. And then I'm going through flexion, extension, isolating lumbar and pelvic stability so that I can use the glutes as the primary extender of the hip. Great. And then I'm going to coordinate that into something a little bit more compound, like a hinging movement, whether that's bilateral, if stability and symptoms will support it, stagger stance, B stance, unilateral. And then something I really like is because of that component where a lot of times anterior knee pain, especially if it is if it's not clinical, if it's subclinical, if it's something that's more repetitive stress in nature, like a lot of people that feel knee pain, creating a better ability to resist anterior translation of that tibia, right? So hamstring. You need to train your hamstrings in isolation. But the way that I like to introduce that is with the constraint of pelvic stability. So like if you have a kneeling hamstring curl, unilateral kneeling hamstring curl accessible to you, I think that's one of the greatest tools that you can use because it's going to limit load. It's going to put you in a position where you have to understand how to control your lumbar spine, your pelvis to be able to create force with the hamstrings. And that's going to lend towards better pelvic stability, better knee mechanics in knee flexion, and then moving towards, as symptoms will allow, an isometric lunge. And you can dial in the variable to how much resistance that person or yourself can handle through variables of front foot elevated, goblet loaded, no load, unilateral load, bilateral load on the flat ground, dialing in where you're loading. But I think kind of the end of the road for this would be loading a lengthened quad, so the rear leg with an anterior load, and being able to do that with perfect pelvic stability. And that's going to be able to put enough stress through the system of the quad and the quad tendon where it's going to give you that stimulus that's going to allow you to train actually that tendon stiffness and kind of get some of that tendon integrity back. And then once you can do that, like you'll see people that have never done this before, they'll shake like a leaf when you put them in this position. But you'll see over time, the progression it's not one of those 0 to 1 things. Like I went from 35 pounds to 45 pounds. It's not one of those things like, oh, I feel solid here. And then once you get them to that point where their nervous system's no longer freaking them out, when you put them in a position where they have to buffer load in a position where you're less able to produce force through the quad, then they're now in a position where you can start training that through more full range of motion concentrically and like change of direction as well.
Yeah, I think the rehab conversation is just an attenuated conversation about training, just pushed down the spectrum, right? So
Right.
these are basic progression principles that follow, towards any goal, right? Getting out of pain, increasing range of motion to increasing power, strength, force output, hypertrophy. All we're doing is we're taking the same thought process and we're just moving it down the line. Right. And each one of these, and this is where I think it's useful to understand that relationship of like, hey, everything you just said is a butting up towards the end of that spectrum of like, hey, this isn't rehab anymore in that part of this spectrum. We're actually into the training side. And one of the things where I see these principles fail most often is if the goal is just to get people out of pain. You need to set on the other side of your spectrum performance at its highest level, because when you do that, you can start to do away with a lot of like the fluff that exists in the rehab world. If my goal is whoever walks in my door, right, whoever I'm working with, is to get them to perform at the highest level, pain is just now like, one wavelength on this continuation of this spectrum of performance. And you don't magnify things. You understand it's like, okay, well, your knee hurts, okay, all right, sick, give me 7 minutes and then we can get back to regularly scheduled programming. But performance isn't your goal. A lot of people kind of drown under the magnitude of this wavelength because they're like, oh, pain. It's like, yeah, that'll be there for sure. Especially if your goal is way over there, there's going to be a lot of those little fucking peaks and valleys you have to deal with. But it's just such a way to like put in perspective as a clinician, like, yeah, okay, pain. You want to win? All right, get used to it. Now can we go fucking win, please? Like where, and so you have to have a performance slant to your approach. If not, like you're always going to be lost. I think this is a framework that I'd like to play out in future episodes in different regions of the body. Because I think that we'll see what I want people to, I hope you guys took away some things and learned some things around the knee specifically, but I want you to learn how to think about rehab and performance as a byproduct of this. So we'll run this back in different regions of the body. If you guys want, leave it in the comment section on YouTube. Like and subscribe and do all the stuff on Spotify, helps out a lot. Check out our homies over at Strength in Context and Paint the Edges podcast. L1 registration up now, www.pre-script.com/PSL1. The opt-in list is open for registration. That will go live December 2nd. As Jay said at the top of the hour, that will make you eligible for L3 by January next year. L2 students for this year, check your inbox. Invites are already out. L3 goes live in about 8 weeks down in Tampa with Jay, myself, and Killian. Did I miss anything?
I think that's it. Thanks for listening, guys.
Friends, enjoy. We'll see you on the next episode.
Yep.